Signs. We see them every day. Traffic signs, promotional signs, informational signs, signs of every kind, all communicating some sort of message to all sorts of viewers. The consequences of responding to most signs are obvious. The consequences of ignoring others can be deadly. For close to 40 years, the John Birch Society has kept a watchful eye on the agendas and progression of the United Nations. The Society has one of the largest research facilities of its kind, which also houses countless articles and documents that analyze and detail UN activity. Using this information, along with commentaries from a host of authorities, some of which you are about to hear, the John Birch Society presents the United Nations, a look into the future. Continuing its practice of financing abortion, the United Nations will not only promote and even enforce abortion as a population control measure, it will criminalize any activity opposing the practice. All pro-life organizations will be closed down, their membership lists confiscated, and the identity of their supporters cataloged as persons to be watched. Anyone continuing to protest abortion will be the recipient of punitive action. Should the UN decide, for whatever reason, that a larger population is desirable, then its pro-abortion policy will suddenly be reversed. In a totalitarian society, people are considered commodities, just like automobiles or widgets, with government planners determining the desired number and then fashioning policies accordingly. Morality is not a factor.
The United Nations has given NGO or non-governmental organization status to all of the very militant pro-abortion population control organizations from the United States and Europe and from around the world, most of whom, many of whom at least, are funded by tax-exempt foundations like Carnegie, Ford, Rockefeller foundations, and by the U.S. government.
The United Nations is pro-abortion. It is that not only in principle, not only in its policies, but also in practice. It is estimated that 50 million babies are killed every year. This is in no small measure due to the United Nations and to both its policy of promoting it intellectually as well as promoting it in the practical field.
So they're very much involved in population control, which means that they're pro-abortion and they support abortion worldwide, both by funding and by changing the laws to support abortion. So if there's anybody in this country who believes in the sanctity of life, they should question the authenticity of the United Nations.
Parents who have chosen to teach their children at home or in private schools will be notified that they must now enroll them in government schools. No exceptions will be allowed, for totalitarian policymakers intend to have the state supplant the family as the most important institution in the heart and mind of the child.
There has been historically an irreducible conflict between the state and the family. They each have contended with the other for primacy in human affairs, because to the extent that the family functions properly, there's very little for the state to do. And every state is, of course, run by men and women who want to increase their powers over other human beings. The way you do that is by giving the state more and more to do. To the extent that the family operates efficiently and properly, the state is left without a whole lot to do, so it cannot expand. It can only expand by absorbing functions which are carried out by non-government entities. The family, of course, is the most important. The church is another.
Speaker and author of What's Right for All Americans, Izola Foster.
I taught high school for 33 years. 22 years were in Watts, South Central Los Angeles. I have seen firsthand the influence of the United Nations on our public education system. The United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, is the education arm of the United Nations. UNESCO is fast becoming an international school board. This means parents will have no choice, parents will have no say. All children will be under the direction of UNESCO. In 1949, UNESCO published a 10-part series for teachers entitled Toward World Understanding. Let me read just one statement. As we have pointed out, it is frequently the family that infects the child with extreme nationalism. The school should therefore use the means described earlier to combat family attitudes. That's UNESCO.
Founder and principal of East Moline Christian School in Illinois, Reverend James R. Patrick has authored America 2000, Goals 2000, Moving the Nation Educationally to a New World Order. His book analyzes the dangerous implications of Goals 2000, the UN-approved Educate America Act.
If we continue to put the Goals 2000 program in, which is an international program, we're going to destroy the very philosophy that this nation was built upon. So the humanistic philosophy, the statist philosophy that has permeated our curriculum, is absolutely destroying our young people. The American people must run and control their own educational program. To do that, they have got to have the control at the local level, which means that where they've consolidated the schools, moved it to the state to the federal, and now the federal is merging into the United Nations. And the philosophy that is coming down through is absolutely destructive of the ideals that our nation was founded upon. We've got to start right at that area and go back to realizing that we're putting in an international educational program. It is coming down through the United Nations. That has got to be eliminated first.
We need to go back to the basics. We need to build families, not divide families. And most of all, we must get our nation out of the United Nations.
The right to keep and bear arms will be abolished. Those retaining ownership of weapons will be required to turn in all arms they possess or face severe penalties. Organizations built upon this God-given right will be raided, and all their records, including membership lists, will be seized and forwarded to world government officials. Persons whose names appear in these records will be visited to assure that all of their weapons have been delivered to the authorities. Aaron Zellman is chairman of Jews for the Preservation of Firearms and has authored numerous publications, including Gun Control, Gateway to Tyranny.
Every single genocide has had one thing in common. First, the government will register firearms, and then confiscate firearms, and then demonize a targeted group of people. And you create in the public's mind the attitude, well, if the government does something forceful to these people, that's all right, they probably had it coming. And then, once the government has disarmed its targeted group, then it's easy for the government to murder those people. It's called genocide. Registration is the key. It is so crucial that if you want to control people and you want to get their firearms from them, you have to know where the firearms are. And the way to do that systematically is through registration. The United States is engaged in doing the very same thing that's been done in Canada, where they've been disarming people, Australia, where they've been disarming people, and the United Nations has had an active hand in this.
I believe those individuals in this country, and there are plenty, who believe that we should have the right to own and bear arms, ought to be concerned with what's happening in the United Nations, because they are a threat to us. They would confiscate our guns. There have been proposals made at some of their conventions where they would literally repeal the Second Amendment. And I think that everybody should be alert to this and realize that this is not just fun and games, and this is just not a discussion club that we're dealing with.
I mean, the United Nations is an organization that, if anybody's interested in saving life, when they hear the name United Nations, they should run in the opposite direction.
The UN will require that the Western world's standard of living, including such achievements as the private automobile and the single-family home, be reduced to a sustainable level. Such sacrifices will be mandatory to counter real or imagined threats, such as global warming, destruction of the ozone layer, and rising levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. No real scientific evidence need be produced. The doomsday claims of coercive utopians will suffice. Hence, limitations on family size will be strictly enforced as an added measure to protect the world's environment. And government licenses will be required for couples desiring children. William Norman Grigg has also written Freedom on the Altar, the UN's crusade against God and family.
The President's Council on Sustainable Development has put out this booklet, which is entitled Population and Consumption, a Task Force Report, that calls for the installation in federal policy of the goals which were created at the Cairo Population Control Summit back in 1994, which have to do once again with what they call stabilizing population. By stabilizing, they're talking about controlling. They're talking about adopting numerical guidelines and objectives defined by the United Nations, enshrining them in federal policy, and reconfiguring our education policy and our healthcare policy to meet the goal of population stabilization. It is a matter of formal federal policy in our country to pursue the population goals outlined by the United Nations. So not only do they think they can do it, they're actively pursuing it right now as we speak. It has to do with this notion that human beings are a resource to be managed, rather than individuals with rights that the state has to protect. As to the environmental aspect of this, there is a dogma in the environmental movement that holds that human beings are simply part of a democratic biosphere, that we have no more innate right to be here than any other species. There are too many of us, and we are exercising our influence in the biosphere in ways that are improper. And in order to reduce the burden upon our holy, sacred Mother Earth, it is necessary to reduce the aggregate numbers of the human population. And I think it's rather interesting to note as well that the type of people who fret about excess population never consider themselves to be among the surplus.
No longer will anyone be allowed to protest or counter the ongoing destruction of property rights planned by various enforcers of environmental laws. The use of land will no longer be decided by those who hold title to it. In order to assure a natural and unmanaged environment, along with the recommended control of the land, agents of world government will spread throughout our nation to ensure compliance. Dr. Michael Kaufman, environmental analyst for Sovereignty International and author of Saviors of the Earth, The Politics and Religion of the Environmental Movement.
This particular belief system is really that philosophical expression of what we would normally call pantheism, the belief that nature is God, God is found in all things. And this is really the official religion or belief or philosophy of the United Nations. And it's expressed, it has some real downsides to it because it means basically if a law benefits man at the expense of nature, then that law is bad because it violates the basic theology of their belief system that everything should be equal. Humans shouldn't benefit at the expense of nature. Now you carry that far enough and ultimately you get to the point where no law is good because every law benefits man at the expense of nature. And man himself is bad. This perversion of our U.S. Constitution, where now a species has more rights than the human, comes right out of the United Nations. It comes in the form of the United Nations treaty called CITES, the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species, and this is a United Nations treaty. And this is how the United Nations is beginning to limit our sovereignty, is through these types of treaties.
Individuals who believe in the right to own property ought to be concerned. Americans believe in that. They're careless about it. Sometimes they allow our governments to regulate too much and to tax us too much. But really, the right of private property ownership is severely threatened by our own government. But it's going to be a lot worse if the United Nations gets involved. There is no way that you can have the concept of private property right. They believe in welfare redistribution, socialist redistribution, that everybody owns everything, and they would take from the wealthy and give to the poor to get an equal balance. Same old story that we've heard for years, but they do not protect the right to own private property by anything promoted by the United Nations.
All members of the U.S. Armed Forces will be given United Nations insignia along with the UN Military Manual. This manual spells out the new requirements regarding conduct, duties, and chain of command. U.S. markings will continue to appear on American uniforms. Soldiers wearing them will be employed primarily as enforcers of peace throughout the world, allowing the rest of mankind to know that the United States is cooperating in the establishment of the New World Order. Author of Changing Commands, The Betrayal of America's Military, John McManus.
The central thesis of my book is that our military is being delivered to the United Nations. Now, I say that very carefully. It's not a case of the UN taking it over as much as our own leaders are delivering our military to the United Nations. President John Kennedy went to the United Nations September 1961, and he presented the United States program for general and complete disarmament in a peaceful world during a speech, and he said, this is the official program of the United States of America. It's a disarmament program. It calls for the United States to turn over its military to the United Nations. Now, let that sit for a second. It calls for the United States to turn over its military to the United Nations. The program ends by saying progressive controlled disarmament would proceed to a point where no state would have the military power to challenge the progressively strengthened UN peace force. The UN would have all military power. One of the great oxymorons of our time is peace force. If it's force, it's not peace. If you define peace as peace with justice, it could be the peace of the grave, it could be peace of submission, there's all kinds of peace. And there are some people who use the word peace meaning something quite different from what the ordinary American would mean. He means peace with justice, peace with freedom, peace with a rule of law that limits the government, not himself so much. Is this program still in effect from 1961? Well, I have personally called the head of the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency in Washington, D.C. in recent years, a man named Dr. William Nary, and asked, is this program still the official policy of the government of the United States? Oh, yes, he said, yes. And much of it has already been accomplished, which is so. So he's confirming what has been obvious to many of us over many, many years. That was 1961. 1962, the State Department finances a document called A World Effectively Controlled by the United Nations. All right? Written by an MIT professor, Massachusetts Institute of Technology professor named Lincoln P. Bloomfield, who certainly happens to be a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. I just want to read a couple of things out of it here. In the definitions section, he says, finally, to avoid endless euphemism and evasive verbiage, the contemplated regime will occasionally be referred to unblushingly as world government. World government means scrap this, scrap the Declaration, scrap the Constitution. We're not going to have world government. If the UN had a monopoly on military force, what it would do is what it says in its own Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It says the rights and freedoms that we Americans take for granted, and of course we shouldn't, they came from God, they came from the Creator. The rights and freedoms may in no case be exercised contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. Now, we've already gone over the fact that the purpose and the principles of the United Nations is to establish a world government with a monopoly of political and military power. It's very clear to me, and what we hope is that it will become far more clear to an awful lot more of the American people. We've got to get out of the United Nations.
The election process will become the task of world government monitors. The U.S. Congress, President, judicial system, and state and local government shall exist only as a facade to assure American citizens that they still have a voice in government. Checks and balances among branches of government will be eliminated. The states will become mere subdivisions of the national government, just as the national government will become a subdivision of the world government. The Bill of Rights portion of the U.S. Constitution will be superseded by the UN Convention on Civil and Political Rights. The U.S. Constitution will be supplanted by the UN Charter and consigned to the ash heap of history, a useless relic of the past. All other UN conventions will take effect. Appointed officials for state and local regions will be forced to comply with these international rules when representing their sectors.
There is a fundamental dichotomy between the United States system and the United Nations system and almost every other system. And that fundamental dichotomy comes from the thunderous assertion in the Declaration of Independence. Men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. We get our rights from God. And then they went on to say, to secure these rights, governments are instituted. So the United Nations comes along. The United Nations, no God. There's never been God at the United Nations. So where do rights come from? The international covenants on civil and political rights. And they go over and they list one after another after another. The right of peaceful assembly shall be recognized. No restrictions may be placed on the exercise of this right other than those imposed in conformity with the law. In other words, we pass a law, you don't have the right. The American system says rights come from God, says government should be limited, and then the Bill of Rights comes along and says Congress shall make no law respecting those fundamental rights. The difference between the U.S. system and the United Nations system couldn't be more obvious.
Many years ago, when I was in high school and college, like millions of other Americans, I was an avid supporter of the United Nations. I believed all the many things that I had learned in grade school and in high school, that after World War II, the founders of the United Nations had come together to form this beneficent organization to create world harmony, brotherhood, peace, and understanding. And who could be opposed to that? It wasn't until later in my college years that I began reading the actual United Nations documents and books which were critical of the United Nations. I began to see the real problem, and it became very apparent to me that we were headed under the United Nations toward a convergence of countries into a global tyranny. Thus the title for my book, Global Tyranny, Step by Step. We were under the United Nations and under the rubric of world brotherhood and understanding, marching into an intended tyranny, and it is happening piecemeal, gradually, step by step.
Tyranny is something which is fastened upon a people incrementally, because most people have sufficient sense that they can recognize a tyrannical proposal when it's made explicitly before them. The American perspective, as articulated by James Madison, is that you discern abuses in principle and you prevent the abuses by denying the principle.
Following the pattern already established in China, only approved churches adhering strictly to government dictates regarding religion will be tolerated. All churches desiring to remain independent of government compliance will be disbanded, their houses of worship converted to other uses, or simply burned to the ground, and their pastors incarcerated. Churches submitting to government regulation will be forced to modify their beliefs to conform with the anti-Christian attitude of the almighty state. No exceptions will be allowed.
The United Nations' hostility to biblical concepts of faith has to do once again with the idea that biblical religions, and in this I would include as well the Islamic religion, while it is not biblical, it has similar perspectives on social responsibilities. All these monotheistic faiths posit something to which the state is accountable, something to which the state ultimately will have to give a reckoning for its abuse of authority. To the extent that there is any doctrine which posits a loyalty higher than that which people have to the state is going to be hostile. And something which proposes to create a global government, as the United Nations unambiguously does, is going to have pitched hostility towards any doctrine which challenges its sovereignty over any aspect of human life.
The one world religion will decide what ethical values they wish to see brought into each country, into each religion. And there will be no choice because the whole thing is control. The entire basis of the one world religion is humanism. And humanism, when you take it back to its roots, is strictly atheism, paganism, and eventually, if you trace it back even further, you are actually right into the occult.
If United Nations has their way, there will be curtailment of our right to practice religion. They are not going to be believers in the right to practice our religions as we have seen fit throughout this country, and therefore those individuals who are interested in this subject certainly cannot be complacent about what the United Nations is doing.
It is certain that these new UN rules governing the American people won't come without resistance. But by then, resistance will be futile. Citizens who attempt to defend whatever freedoms they have remaining will join the victims of the inevitable brutality and bloodbath carried out by a tyrannical UN dictatorship. For those still wondering if the United Nations would actually resort to such atrocities, consider for a moment the UN's lesser-known side. The United Nations organization was originally created by a small but powerful group of subversives as a future seat of a one-world government, camouflaged as the world's last hope for peace. And concealed by a barrage of self-generated propaganda, the UN has been responsible for some of the most controversial and violent acts of aggression in history. Since its founding in 1945, the UN has made gradual and significant progress toward the ultimate goal of its founders, world domination. Today, enormous in size and influence, the UN has a countless number of programs, agendas, and conventions ready to supersede the laws and practices of all nations, most certainly including the United States. Fortunately, more and more Americans are beginning to see the wisdom of what the John Birch Society has been saying for well over 3.5 decades. Get us out of the UN. March 20th, 1997, Capitol Hill. Texas U.S. Representative Ron Paul introduces one of the most crucial bills regarding the future of freedom, the American Sovereignty Restoration Act. Its purpose, to provide for complete withdrawal of the United States from the United Nations.
Well, I don't think we need the United Nations to be able to talk to other nations. The United Nations was established in 1945. We talked to a lot of nations before that. We have our embassies, we have our ambassadors, we can pick up a telephone these days and talk to whoever we want around the world. So I do not think that is a legitimate excuse. That is just an excuse to do the bad things that the United Nations does. Every year since we belonged to the United Nations, we have lost a little bit of our sovereignty. And we're moving in that direction where eventually we will not have the United States of America and we'll be nothing more than a pawn of the United Nations.
It didn't take long for word to get out. Soon, Dr. Paul's office received messages from other representatives willing to co-sponsor the bill, and an avalanche of congratulatory letters from the American people thanking him for introducing this crucial bill covered his desk. June 4th, 1997, 54 representatives vote in favor of the Get Us Out measure. A few years ago, it was unlikely if 4 representatives would have supported it. Even though the measure didn't pass, the numbers are a solid indicator of the accelerated support for the United States' immediate withdrawal from the UN. And with the help of more and more Americans, Congress will again be forced to vote whether or not to get us out of the United Nations for good.
The Congress tends to be political at times. They tend to respond to what they hear, and if they think there's enough people in their district that want them to vote a certain way, they all of a sudden will become interested. The American people are starting to wake up. I think we're making a lot of progress, and I predict we're going to get a lot more votes next time.
Many Americans are working to influence Congress on important issues, several of which have been discussed in this program. Clearly, the Get Us Out issue stands above them all. For if we allow the UN to become an all-powerful government, victories in Congress will become meaningless, and the causes of single-issue activists will be permanently lost. But with your help, we can rescue our nation from the United Nations and preserve liberty for generations to come.
Effective action is informed, organized action. For more information on the UN threat and what you can do to help get us out, call 1-800-JBS-USA-1 today. Ask for the UN packet.